Throughout the Middle Ages, the Islamic world had been more technologically advanced than Europe.
Examples that leap to mind have to do with their architecture, their navigation, their observations of astronomical data, and so forth. A lot of European science actually winds up deriving a great benefit from the Muslim world once they start to make contact by the late Middle Ages.
In the early 15th century, Europe was just recovering from a wave of epidemic diseases that had ravaged the continent for more than a century. Most Europeans were agricultural peasants, poor and often malnourished. Unlike Africa and the Americas, where women played prominent roles, men dominated all aspects of life in Europe. For 1,000 years, the Catholic Church had been the central institution in Europe. It not only controlled religious life, but played a major role in the political, economic, and cultural life of Europe as well. But in the 15th century, the power of the Church was eroding. Cities were growing, and centralized states like France and Spain were becoming stronger. Commerce was expanding, and merchants were getting rich. As the feudal system broke down, large estates were broken up into smaller plots which could be bought and sold as private property. The Bible taught European Christians that man had dominion over the earth. And as people worked to improve their lives, they saw the land, forests, rivers, and animals as resources to exploit for private gain. Economic growth, coupled with the new ideas unleashed by a renaissance in the sciences and the arts, were revolutionizing Europe. More and more people were coming to believe that mysteries could be understood and problems solved by thinking about them rationally. This attitude supported scientific inquiry and led to a number of important inventions and technological innovations.
The printing press was one possible way for people to know more, not that anybody printed much of anything in the early years except the Bible. But new kinds of ships and new navigation equipment that made it possible to go farther from home.
Meanwhile, Christian armies were gaining ground in their long war against the Muslims who had ruled Spain for 700 years. And Christian soldiers fighting religious wars to capture Jerusalem from the Muslims were bringing back to Europe exotic new plants, spices, fabrics, jewels, and other treasures that Europeans wanted more of.
Europeans had to trade with Islamic traders because everything that the Europeans wanted, like gold and ivory and eventually slaves, were on the other side of the Islamic frontier. So whether they were importing spices from the east or gold from West Africa, they had to go through Islamic middlemen.
Many began to wonder, was there a water route that would give them direct access to the Indies?
So one of the interests Europeans had, and when they developed the technology to do so, they began to think of finding another way to what they called the Orient, the spice trade, the gold and the silver that would make them rich.
In Portugal, a small and isolated nation on the far western edge of Europe, Prince Henry the Navigator thought that by sailing south along the coast of Africa, he could open new trade routes to Black Africa and the Indies.
Henry the Navigator was the prince of the ocean, and he gathered around him scientists, he gathered around him map makers, he gathered around him sailors. He started a school of navigation.
Prince Henry sponsored a series of expeditions down the west coast of Africa. By the 1470s, the Portuguese had reached the Niger River Delta and the city-states of Benin, where the king gave them permission to trade for gold, ivory, and slaves. Each year they sailed further south, setting up trading posts along the way. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the southern tip of Africa. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama finally reached India. The water route to Asia was a reality. But the African continent was much bigger than Prince Henry had thought, and any voyages to India would take a long time. Might there be a shorter route to the Indies? European scientists knew that the world was round and had made fairly accurate estimates of its size. Japan, they guessed correctly, was some 11,000 miles to the west. Many ships had explored the Atlantic, finding the Madeira and Azore Islands. But what lay beyond remained a mystery. Mariners' stories of monstrous creatures and unsolved disappearances offered little encouragement for long voyages into the unknown. But there were tales of land beyond the Atlantic. According to an old Viking legend, in the year 1000, Leif Erikson had sailed west from a Viking village on Greenland and come to a flat land covered with trees, which the Vikings called Vinland. Archaeologists confirmed the story in the 1960s when they uncovered the remains of a Viking encampment in Newfoundland, Canada. But 11th century Europeans had no need for cold, distant lands inhabited by hostile peoples. After 4 or 5 attempts to build settlements in Vinland, the Vikings left and did not return.
But the significant thing about Leif Erikson is that he's lost to history and had very little effect on subsequent colonization.
By the late 15th century, the situation was very different. Backed by growing economies, new technologies, and a lust for riches, Europeans were willing to take some chances. Onto this scene stepped Cristobal Colon, who we know as Christopher Columbus.
Christopher Columbus was a man from Genoa, a seagoing man, a very experienced ship captain, but he only knew a very limited part of the world.
Convinced that the Earth was smaller than most scientists said, and that the Indies lay only 3,000 miles to the west, Columbus wanted the King of Portugal to bankroll him for a voyage across the Atlantic. The king had no interest in such harebrained schemes. But King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain liked Columbus's plan, for it offered them a way to beat the Portuguese to Asia. The king and queen were also devout Catholics, and they were impressed by Columbus's deep faith and his promise to convert to Catholicism any heathens he found in the Indies.
One went out in order to spread the greater glory of the church, which was also linked to the greater glory and one hope to the profit of the state. So they gave Columbus enough support so that he could have the 3 ships that sent him off into the western waters, and of course eventually he touched down in Hispaniola, which is part of the Caribbean, and discovered, quote, the New World, even though he never knew he discovered it.
October 12, 1492. 3 small ships appeared in the morning light off an island its inhabitants called Guanahani, somewhere in the Bahamas. Soon, strange men with white faces and bodies encased in some unknown covering and shiny shells around their chests rowed to shore. The Arawaks, being a curious and peaceful people, showed up to greet them. Unacquainted with steel, some of them cut their hands, grasping the Spaniards' swords. An exchange of food and water to drink for some beads and trinkets seemed to cement a promising friendship.
He hit these islands. He convinced himself that he had achieved what God had said he would achieve. He would find this route. And thus he dubbed the natives Indians, for example, and he acted as if he was in the outer reaches of what today we'd call Japan, and then with a little more effort he would find what today we call China.
Indians is a wrong term to describe Native Americans. Indians are people that are indigenous to India, and they think that Columbus discovered us, but we weren't discovered. We knew who we were, and we had a flourishing culture way before they ever set their foot on the New World.
Looking for gold, Columbus sailed on to Cuba and Hispaniola and claimed them as well. The native people were curious, friendly, and generous, but they had very little gold. Still, the King and Queen of Spain were delighted with Columbus's voyage and agreed to sponsor more expeditions. This time, Columbus promised to find the Emperor of China and bring back gold, spices, and slaves. But he didn't find the Emperor on his next voyage or the next one after that. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Americas, visiting many islands and the coasts of Central and South America. He died still believing he had found Asia. But the European explorers who followed him soon realized that Columbus had stumbled upon a vast and exotic new world of incredible wealth and beauty.